Hello, I'm Colin Flora of Pavlok Law in Indianapolis, and I'm here to share the ISBA's member memoir for the day. So I have been asked to do this apparently because my fascination with not only books, but specifically books on Indiana legal history has drawn some attention. I will start, despite not being a book on Indiana legal history, I want to start with a quote that I think pretty well summarizes the value of history. It comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes, and it's simply, "A page of history is worth a volume of logic." And I think that not only does a pretty good job of putting the role of history into perspective, but really puts into perspective the value of understanding history in the practice of law. So I'm going to delve here into in a second into some of my fairly voluminous collection of Indiana books on law, and we'll see what I'm missing, what I've got, and what you didn't even know maybe existed. For those wondering where the quote came from, a book that is not on Indiana legal history, but I'd strongly recommend, Rag Bag of Legal Quotations. Maybe cost you about $50 online, but worth a tremendous amount of knowledge, not only from Justice Holmes, but from many others. So to start with, let's grab the ones that I think every single lawyer that wants to know anything about Indiana history should have on his or her shelf. First two to start with, and in no small part because they're the easiest to get your hands on. Number one, History of Indiana Law. The amount of information in this small book is absolutely mind-bending, and you will do yourself a tremendous service and your clients, especially if you're a litigator, by reading up, studying Indiana history in this book. The collection is not surpassed by anything I've encountered, and it is easily the number one gift I dole out to attorneys. So some of you may very well have a copy from me, and those of you who don't, I'm sure there's many more copies I'll be giving out over the years. Number two, Justices of the Indiana Supreme Court. Ironically, the book begins with the recognition that they don't expect anyone, the authors, I guess the editors, because each justice's entry is authored by a different person. The editors didn't expect anyone to sit down and read it from cover to cover, so it is not written to be read cover to cover, and it's not written to be a comprehensive history of the court, but of the justices. That said, you certainly can. It can get a little bit confusing if you're trying to read it as a history of the court, just because if you go justice to justice, there's some splits. You can go from one, because it's based on when the justice took his or her seat. So you can jump years at a time with one justice and then come and have two or three that came and went within the immediately prior justice's career. That said, another one in my list that is one of the most treasured books in my possession, just because it was so difficult to get my hands on, is Who's Your Justice? A History of the the Supreme Court of Indiana, I believe. Yes. If you go to the Supreme Court Law Library, they've got 3, 4, maybe even 5 copies. I'll note they've got more copies of this than the Justices of the Indiana Supreme Court. But this actually is a comprehensive history of the court that only tangentially gets in on the justices. I believe this might go up to Justice Bohm. The Justices of the Indiana Supreme Court, I believe, goes up through Justice David. So those are your great overviews. A conversation I had a couple years back with then Chief Judge Vedic on the Court of Appeals led me to believe that the Court of Appeals may one day have a book out on its own judges, but if it's come out, I've missed it. I've tried to keep an eye open for it, so let me know if it has. Continuing on with Indiana justices, though. If you don't know who Isaac Blackford is, you really are missing out on one of the most important points, at least one of the most important figures in Indiana history. At one point, Isaac Blackford, so if you look at the old reporters for the Indiana Supreme Court, odds are you're going to see Isaac Blackford's name. Even if you didn't realize it, you'll see it listed as Blackford's reports. And that's because once upon a time it was really hard to get reports of courts. Reporters were done by private individuals. You'll see that with the Supreme Court of the United States as well. And Isaac Blackford was notorious for being very detail-oriented. In fact, his reports were often delayed, and he'd have to pay fines to his publisher. But they became as important to many law libraries as Blackstone. So I believe this book is, yes, Isaac Blackford, the Indiana Blackstone. Absolute must read. There are a handful of works on Isaac Blackford. Another one, also published by the Indiana Supreme Court, is a collection that, if memory serves, one of these two, I think it's this one, is actually, no, this one is a collection, I think, of articles written about him, whereas this one was a collection written by a man who knew him, who was much younger than Blackford, but hadn't been published at the time. Another can't miss on the Indiana Law Library, Federal Justice in Indiana. Yes, in Indiana. It's a history of technically the Southern District of Indiana, not the Northern District. So it tracks the federal court in Indiana up until the split, and then it follows just the Southern District. If you didn't know what you didn't know about the Southern District of Indiana will blow your mind. I mean, I'm sure many practitioners now don't even realize the courthouse in Indianapolis used to also be a post office. So pick up a copy. Most of these that I've gone through so far, with the exception of the Jerome Withered book, Who's Your Justice, are fairly easy to get your hands on. I don't know that too many of them are still in publication, but you can get them online pretty easily. Another one to add, sticking with, or returning, I guess, to Indiana Supreme Court justices, Who's Your Justice in Nuremberg? It may surprise you, but we sent 2 members of the Indiana Supreme Court to the Nuremberg trials, and this is a great collection that talks about their service there. And again, I'd add that to any library. Now, jumping to some more obscure titles. One that, if you've done much work in Indiana legal history, you will have come across, at least the name, is Leander Monks. Now, you'll see that this is clearly not an original copy. There are companies, primarily, I think most of them are based out of India, that take classic works that are in the public domain and compile them, print them, and sell them for, I don't want to say I'm a collector on something like this where I don't have the original, but at the very least it gives me access and have a hard copy. A lot of this you can find online. For me, I want a hard copy. It's a 3-volume set on Indiana judges, legal history, and lawyers in the early, I guess, from 1800 to 1926. So absolutely indispensable part of your collection. Everyone should at some point read it. And, frankly, if you do any reading on Indiana legal history, you're going to see Leander Monks cited 1,000,001 times. It's an indispensable work. Couple other titles that are a bit more obscure that I strongly recommend, though. Early Indiana Trials and Sketches. It's not on the level with Leander Monks, but really great read of early, I guess, trials and sketches. Give you a good insight into early practice in Indiana law. So a couple more things I'm going to add in here that are a bit more obscure. Well, I guess one particularly obscure. I had no idea this book existed until I found it at a bookstore and had to pick it up. It is called History of a Hoosier Law Firm, and it's the Ice Miller history from 1910 to 1980. I think this book cost me about $50. And once upon a time when I was looking online, the only copy I could find was something like $300. I think somebody trying to catch a young associate there who wanted to know a little bit more about the firm. I did take a look right before I hopped on here, and it looks like a copy sold on eBay about a month ago, I think, for $65. So, but not everything's old. Here we have the newest addition to my collection. I have not yet even had a chance to go through this, but it's a history of the IU Mauer School. I think it's primarily in photos with a little bit of text to boot. So I can't necessarily recommend how great this is, but it had to join the collection as soon as it was a book on Indiana history. Speaking of Indiana's Mauer School, as of, I guess, just a couple weeks ago, Indiana now has 3 justices of the Supreme Court of the United States who have studied law in Indiana. Obviously, that's now Justice Amy Coney Barrett. We otherwise generally would know Justice Sherman Minton, IU Mauer alumnus. But what we also often don't look, and the reason I point that out, a couple of volumes on Sherman Minton's biographies. I strongly recommend picking these up, especially, I think one of them is called, Yes, Indiana Supreme Court Justice. So if you're studying Indiana law, legal history, I don't know how you can leave out a book called Indiana Supreme Court Justice. But often overlooked is another man who was only a temporary Hoosier, and that is the Supreme Court Justice who immediately preceded Sherman Minton, and that was Justice Wiley Rutledge. A little known fact, he lived in Bloomington for a little bit of time, and for 1 year studied at the Mauer School before transferring and getting his degree at, I believe it was Colorado, but don't quote me on that. Trying to think, and then kind of rounding out the list of obscure titles in my collection, but things to just keep on the radar. So there's a collection. It's ultimately a 4-volume collection. I've got one here. I actually just ordered 2 more. I'm missing volume 1. I've yet to get my hands on that. but I've ordered volumes 2 and 4. But it's on Constitution making in Indiana. It's a collection of, I guess, fourth volume is just a collection of documents related to constitutional amendments in Indiana. But volume 1 is on the original Constitution, volume 2 is on the second Constitution, then volume 3 picks up from 1916 to 1930. These little works were part of a collection that were put out in the early 20th century by the Indiana Historical, I think it's Historical Society, Historical Bureau, I believe. So, Indiana Library and Historical Board. There we go. So, there are collections like this that include this bibliography of laws of Indiana. It's got a great, about 15, 20-page intro on the history of the formation of Indiana from Northwest Territories to the Indiana Territory, and then easy to overlook now that since we're used to the Indiana codes post-1970s revision, where it is actually easy to go through, is there was a time where knowing what the Indiana laws were very difficult at times, the statutes. Obviously, we had Burns' annotated statute, but just being able to find from session to session what the laws were could be very complex, and that's where something like the Bibliography of Laws of Indiana came in very handy for practitioners. Fortunately, not as much for us now, unless you're doing some research like I often do with old laws. I've left over on the shelf collections on the laws of the Indiana Territory, laws of Northwest Territory. You can find those. They were right around the start of the 20th century when you got into the 100th anniversary of Indiana and Illinois. The Indiana Historical Society, I believe it was Historical Society, but again, might be Historical Board, what have you, put out bound collections of the ordinances. Illinois did the same, so you can pick those up. I think they're worthwhile. But the one thing I know that I'm missing is I do not have a collection of Isaac Blackford's law reports, so if anybody's got a good lead on that, let me know. That's something I'm always looking to add. Other than that, if you know of anything I'm missing, I'm sure there's definitely things I could add to the list. I will, just to show how you can find some great finds at random bookstores. This is a road trip guide to Indiana historical sites that just basically takes you county by county. Well, I guess it's got pre-scripted tours that will take you on a driving trip and just show you the history of Indiana, and you read along. So, aside from that, if there are things that you think I'm missing and would recommend, I absolutely would love to see it. And, for those of you that read my article a couple years back on sentimental damages that started with the premise of my bookshelf I built with my grandfather, if you were wondering what went on the bookshelf, well, you got a sense of some of these are on the bookshelf there, most of these are in my office, and a couple of these are on different bookshelves at the house. So, point being, that's what I do. This has been my entry on the ISBA's member memoir, and hope it wasn't a complete waste of time for you.